Members of the Penobscot Nation are filing civil complaints against the Roman Catholic Diocese of Portland, claiming they were victims of childhood sexual abuse at a church on Indian Island. Attorneys from Berman and Simmons say 3 of the victims were abused at St. Anne Parish between 1972 and 1979, when they were between the ages of 7 and 12. They say the other victim was 16 when he was abused in 1987, and the 3 priests accused of child abuse are Marcel Robity, David Paul Coate, and Leo James Michaud. Attorney Michael Bigo says this is yet another case of the Maine Catholic Diocese failing to protect children across the state.
Let them be a symbol of the worst of the cover-up and the secrecy and the enabling of the abuse, and let them have their day in court. Let this filing of their lawsuits allow the discovery process to proceed. Let us find out what the diocese knew and when they knew it.
One of the plaintiffs who was present at today's press conference says he saw others speak up about the abuse and realized he was not alone. Until the statute of limitations on child sexual abuse was lifted in 2021, survivors had no legal path to hold alleged abusers accountable. Berman and Simmons is now handling 25 lawsuits against the diocese, and we reached out to the diocese for a comment, but we have not heard back.